Hello, thank you very much and good morning for all of you who joined us to this discussion at the Budapest Global Dialogue. Thank you, and again, without further ado, we are about to start the conversation. But if you just allow me to have a comment, I think directing a conversation between one of the key persons of the foreign policy of Hungary and one of the can I say our times Machiavelli or the apostle of realism today is of course an honoring job, but also a very humble exercise. So I try to minimize my job here and try to pose the questions that interest us the most. And I think once we are here in Central Europe, in Europe today, I think the most important question is how to end, if there is one end to the war in Ukraine, how to end it. Is there something inside? I think this is one question that interests us the most. And pardon me, Balázs, but I think for first, Professor Mearsheimer, what is your take on the issue?
My view on how to end the war in Ukraine is that in an ideal world, you would end it diplomatically as soon as possible, and you would reach a meaningful peace agreement. In other words, a lasting peace agreement. I don't think that's possible, and obviously I don't think that's going to happen. And the reason is that the differences between the Russians on one side and the Ukrainians plus the West on the other side are so profound that there is no deal to be had. The Russians have three central demands that are basically non-negotiable. One is that Ukraine and the West recognize their annexation of the 4 oblasts in the east plus Crimea. Number two, that Ukraine be a neutral state, which means it can't be in NATO and there can't be a Western security guarantee. And number three, that the size and the quality of the Ukrainian military be reduced to the point where Ukraine has no offensive military capability against Russia. Those are three demands that I can understand why the Russians are making. From a Russian point of view, those demands make excellent sense. From a Ukrainian point of view, I can understand why they categorically reject those demands and say they will never accept them. Well, given a situation where you have a set of demands on the table that the Russians have made that the Ukrainians will not accept, and I believe the West will not accept either, there's no way you can get a diplomatic solution. And this tells me that this war will be settled on the battlefield. And at some point, you will get a frozen conflict. And that frozen conflict means that you will have poisonous relations inside of Europe in terms of relations between the Russians on one side, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the United States on the other side for as far as you can see. So I'd say that, unfortunately, the ideal solution is not realizable in this case.
I think if the best option is to have a frozen conflict, then have it as soon as possible. From the decision maker side, from the practitioner side, what is your take on Balázs?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much, Professor, for being here and having the conversation. Here in Hungary, we all are Mearsheimer fans, so I think every Hungarian politician must be a realist, because if we Hungarian politicians are not realists but rather naive, then our situation becomes very, very quickly complicated. So it's very good to have the realist point of view here in Hungary. About the war. Please allow me to start with the personal memory. I know it's history, but it's recent history, and I think it's very, very interesting. When my prime minister became the president of the European Council for like 6 months last year, he started the so-called peace mission. He told us just from one day to another. That's, guys, let's use this as a window of opportunity. Let's try to do something. We have to go to Kiev to see Zelensky. Haven't been there since the war, so let's go to Kiev, then to Moscow. Then let's try to ask the Chinese for a meeting on Friday, whether they are ready to host us on Monday. It seemed to be impossible, but it happened. We went to Beijing, and then there was a NATO summit in Washington, and the Prime Minister we met with President Trump, who was back then still the candidate in Mar-a-Lago. And then when we were flying home, the Prime Minister decided to make a letter. So he wanted to inform the European leaders what his experience was. And he said, it's transparent. You can still read it in English, in Hungarian. And it was sent to all European leaders. And he said that for various reasons, both parties, so the Ukrainians and the Russians, are convinced that they have to continue the war, because they think that what they can get, this is what was described by the professor in a different way, they can get a better result or an acceptable result if they continue the war, because what they can get now without the war is not acceptable for the parties. So if you have a situation like this, it's obvious that you need to have outside mediators, big guys in the room who are putting pressure on these war parties and trying to convince them that it could be the other way around as well, and the decision should be made by them, but they have benefits if they accept the reality and get back to the table of diplomacy. And my Prime Minister said that okay, the Democrats are involved in the conflict. They are having, as it was admitted after that, a proxy war through Ukraine against Russia, and President Trump has a chance to act differently. And what happened? He started to act differently. He started to act as a neutral outsider mediator. According to our understanding, this is a good starting point. This is a good position, and this is still a window of opportunity that the international community together can put pressure on, but I'm talking about diplomatic pressure on both sides to sit down and try to achieve something. My major, I don't know whether it's possible or not. I accept the pessimistic analysis of the professor, but I still hope for a more optimistic scenario. What concerns me is that the West is not united. So I think that the Europeans now having a very bad role in that situation, because rather supporting the United States' new initiative, they are still involved in the conflict, and they are still acting in favor of one player or one party, the Ukrainian party, and they still want to continue the war based on their own calculation and based on the Ukrainian calculations. And what is happening now is Europe is undermining the peacemaking efforts of United States. And still what is happening on the battlefield is a horrible story. Like hundreds and hundreds of people are dying on both sides for nothing. At the end there will be a solution. I think there will be a frozen conflict, but we don't see the reason why this bloodshed is happening on a daily basis. So we as Hungarian politicians and the country which is represented in the European Council, we are very much concerned that despite all the difficulties which were very precisely described by the professor, there is still a chance to achieve something through diplomacy, but Europe is not playing in its role in that. And I think it's very shameful.
Could I make one additional point?
Please do that.
Just to add to what Baljas has said, it's very important, I think, to understand that from the Russian point of view, what's happening in Ukraine is an existential threat. The idea of moving NATO into Ukraine is considered a threat to Russia's survival. Many people in the West find that hard to understand. On the other side, from Ukraine's point of view, what Russia is doing inside of Ukraine is seen as an existential threat. Obviously, they're taking sacred territory and annexing it, making it part of Russia. This is obviously an existential threat. So in the West, what you find is a lot of people are looking for bargaining space between the Ukrainians on one side and the Russians on the other side. There's no bargaining space there because you have two countries that think they're dealing with an existential threat. And then to build on the point that you were making, the Europeans, much less so than the Americans, but the Europeans are steadily reaching the point where they're describing Russia as an existential threat. This is how the Europeans are getting their publics to ante up to build powerful militaries. They're saying the Russians are coming. They're going to conquer all of Ukraine. Then they're going to conquer Eastern Europe. Then they're going to conquer Western Europe. Again, the Russians are an existential threat. So once you get into a world where all the players think the other side is an existential threat, there's no bargaining space. And this, again, is why I think this is a hopeless situation in terms of coming up with a solution of a political sort, and why I think it'll be settled on the battlefield.
If I may join to the point what was made by the professor, and again get back to the 6 months presidential term as a European Council leader of Hungary. Our biggest achievement in that 6 months period of time was the Budapest Declaration, which was the first declaration after the European parliamentary elections and the establishment of the new institutional leadership in Brussels, when all the member states agreed to give a mandate to the institutional leaders that in the upcoming 5 years term, they should focus on restoring European competitiveness. This was the takeaway of the Budapest Declaration, that guys, according to the Letta report, Draghi report, we are in serious trouble and we have to change that course. And for this reason, your job is to focus on restoring European competitiveness. And what happened since then, and what is happening since Trump was elected and the American position changed in Europe, no one is anymore talking about competitiveness. Everybody is talking about the rearmament of Europe, but through Ukraine. And as it was described by the professor, the war machine and the war propaganda is very visible, because the political elite of Brussels, they desperately want to convince the European people that they are under an existential threat and they have to accept that their living standards are going down because they have to finance Ukraine. And they use this as a further argument to, again, push the centralization of power towards Brussels. Because if you are in a war and if you have an existential threat, then, okay, this kind of sovereignty or subsidiarity, these issues are not important anymore. Then you have a centralized, then you need a centralized superstate, which is preparing for a war which is inevitable. This is the argumentation. And we Hungarians, we are saying it for like 10 years, that Europeans should be able to defend themselves. NATO is very important. But if you are not able to defend ourselves, then we are relying on the American position. This is exactly what happened after 2022. First, the Germans and the French, they didn't want to follow the American line. They were resisting a little bit, but then the reality was very hard. The Biden administration was saying this is our proxy war now against against Russia, and we all have to be united. And sooner or later, all the European countries, the only exception was Hungary back at that time, saying, okay, we are in line with your position. And Europe couldn't make an independent foreign policy or a trade policy. So this is why European NATO is very important, but European independent military capability is also very important. But it doesn't mean that we have to prepare an existential conflict against the Russians, and by doing this, we are integrating into our security structure a country which has direct war right now with Russia. So European security is not going through Ukraine, it's going through ourselves. And this is the conflict what we have now. And this is why I'm very much worried, because what's going on in Brussels, and it's not just happening, it's a strategy, and they decided that. It's very irresponsible.
Thank you very much. This panel increasingly looking like a date when your date brings along a significant other, but it's a good thing actually, because you are doing the hard job of this conversation. But it really makes me like more picky of what kind of questions I can pose to you, and definitely I think at this point we should address the question of escalation. So if neither side is very much interested in making a deal right now, making peace, even though the rest of the globe is pretty much interested in that, and the situation will be ultimately decided on the battlefield. So what bears Russia, for instance, using nuclear weapons, even tactical ones, to put an end to this conflict and say, okay, these are my terms, and then I can just go forward. Do you see any kind of escalation like this from a realist perspective?
I think that it is extremely unlikely that Russia would use nuclear weapons unless it was losing on the battlefield. In the beginning of the war in 2022, I think that the United States thought that it could deliver a significant defeat to Russia and knock it out of the ranks of the great powers. In the year 2022, because the Russian army was then in poor shape, relatively poor shape, and the Ukrainian military was doing very well on the battlefield, we thought that we could defeat the Russians on the battlefield inside of Ukraine. That's number one. And number two, as you all remember, we thought that economic sanctions would bring the Russians to their knees. We would deliver these devastating sanctions that would cripple the Russian economy. And that, coupled with the defeats on the battlefield, would effectively knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. Had that happened, I think the Russians would have probably used nuclear weapons in Ukraine to rescue the situation. And you all want to remember that if Russia were to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it would not have to fear nuclear retaliation, because Ukraine has no nuclear weapons of its own, and there is no way the West would use its nuclear weapons to defend Ukraine. So in a situation where the Russians were backed into a corner, were facing a defeat that was going to knock them out of the ranks of the great powers, I think in that circumstances, it's highly likely they would turn to nuclear weapons. Now, the good news is that's not going to happen. And the reason is that the Russians are winning the war on the battlefield. And the situation is deteriorating for the Ukrainians and for the West. This is why I would argue that the Ukrainians should cut a deal now, because they're going to just lose more territory and more Ukrainians are going to die if they continue the war. And the reason is that the Russians are winning. If you look at the balance of manpower, the balance of artillery, the balance of air power, it's manifestly clear that the Russians are in the driver's seat. And if you take into account the fact that President Trump wants to withdraw significant support for Ukraine, that means that Ukraine is going to lose its principal patron. And it was losing even when Joe Biden was in the White House. You can imagine how bad the situation is going to get if Donald Trump refuses to put more weaponry and more money into the Biden pipeline. So Ukraine is doomed. It's not like Ukraine is going to go down to decisive defeat. There's going to end up being a dysfunctional rump state. Ukraine is going to continue to exist, but it'll be a dysfunctional rump state. All of this is a long way of saying that given that the Russians are winning, there's no incentive for them to use nuclear weapons. And that is good news. But the fact that the Ukrainians are losing is obviously bad news from Ukraine's point of view.
What do you think, Balázs, about the potential escalation? I think there is now a very heavy European discourse about, supporting Ukraine, even against, for instance, American attempts at making a peace deal, or at least pushing the sides to this direction. And there is something that we can also label as warmongering. Don't you think? So what can be the result of all this? Can this lead to an escalation of any sort?
So I think we are still in a circle of escalation. When Trump came in, he did some great things. First, he restored communication between the Americans and the Russians, which is a very important step towards de-escalation. And then he organized direct meetings between Ukrainians and the Russians, which is, again, a very good sign of de-escalation. And there was a prisoners exchange, very short-term ceasefire, changing the dynamism, but it seems like, I don't know whether it's because of the Middle East, the new conflict coming in and being the top priority now, or it has another reason, but these days it seems that this circle of de-escalation stopped and it went back a little bit. So attacking the nuclear triad of Russia, speeding up the process of EU accession of Ukraine, which is, I think, also a security issue because European Union is and basically it's a cooperation of based on economic fields, but now the European integration has a security element as well. And why the Western liberal elites want to integrate Europe into the European Union? Obviously, because they want to use that money channels to transfer funds and military support to Ukraine to further go with the war. So in this respect, EU accession and this speeding up process is also a circle of escalation. So I'm still worried, and for us Hungarians, it's not just about mathematics and rational calculation of responsible nuclear powers and special type of game scenarios. But I was born in '86. In '86, I don't remember, but my family told the story that there was the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe, and I couldn't eat any fruits and vegetables for like months. And so this is a memory which has every Hungarian family. That means that something terrible could happen on the territory of Ukraine. A nuclear accident can happen, and it has a very dangerous and very devastating consequence of the everyday life of the Hungarians. So if there is a tiny little chance of this happening again, I think all Hungarians, in a very reasonable way, they say that we shouldn't go to that direction. We should stop and turn around and get back as fast as we can. So it's and this kind of small or medium-sized Central European country perspective, so new nuclear army perspective, it's different. It's more personal. It's more existential. It's not just a calculation between the big powers where they look on the map and they know this is one front line where we use our leverage over the others, they use their leverage over the others, and you know, here are the people, and those people are dying in Ukraine. We all have relatives, and we still remember what happened in '86. But everybody was terrified when the news came that something nuclear happened in Ukraine. So this is, from our point of view, also an existential issue. But for us, not the war, but the peace is an existential issue.
Can I make one additional point just on the whole subject of Ukraine? I think it's very important to emphasize that President Trump is a lot like Prime Minister Orban in two ways. Number one is, I think both of them appreciate Russia's position and want to have good relations with Russia and want to shut down this war as quickly as possible. So I don't think there's a lot of daylight between the views of Prime Minister Orban and President Trump on the whole Ukraine issue. But the second point is, President Trump is surrounded by a national security community in the United States that is remarkably hawkish and goes to great lengths to undermine his approach to dealing with Ukraine. And I think the situation is similar here in Europe, and that Prime Minister Orban and Hungary more generally is surrounded by a number of European states.
But not the people around Prime Minister Orban,
Yes.
the people in Brussels, so I want to save my job.
Yes, that's what I meant, the people in Brussels. And I think, just to go to the American case, I think one of the problems that Trump faces is that there is huge resistance inside the United States. There's also huge resistance inside Europe, leaving aside Hungary, to reaching any kind of accommodation with the Russians. This is why I find it hard to believe that Trump could accept Russia's demands. He'd be crucified inside the United States, not to mention inside of Europe.
Okay, but staying with the issue of realism, and just speaking on what you said, Professor Mearsheimer, about this discourse in Europe, which is like, let's say, pro-war or pro-Ukraine, is there any realist attitude behind it? Is there anything that you can identify as that this is why they do that? This is not, you know, something in the territory of ideology, let's say, or behavior, but rather realist approach. Is there anything in European attempts of a military build-up that is good for Europe?
Well, let me just say a few words on realism in Europe. I used to say during the unipolar moment that Europe was a realist-free zone. There were no realists in Europe. I hardly got invited to Europe, and when I got invited to Europe, I was treated like a dinosaur. And the reason was very simple. Liberalism and a liberal foreign policy was the way the vast majority of Europeans thought about the world. Many of you probably, or many of the younger people in the audience probably find this hard to believe, but that was the case during the unipolar moment. And we adopted a very liberal foreign policy. You want to understand that NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, which starts in 1994, that's when the Clinton administration decides to expand NATO. 99 is the first tranche. That, of course, is when Hungary is brought in. 2004 is the second tranche. It was not aimed at containing Russia. It was aimed at spreading the Western liberal order that had sprouted up in the western part of Europe during the Cold War towards the East. It was a very liberal foreign policy. And a number of realists argue, people like me, people like George Kennan, right, and numerous other people, including the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this is in the 1990s, that if you move NATO eastward, and especially if you went into Ukraine, the Russians were going to react. This was basic realist logic at play. And the fact is that the Clinton administration, the vast majority of Europeans, refused to accept that logic. They thought about the world in very liberal terms. This is one of the principal reasons that most Europeans today and most Americans today fail to appreciate the fact that Russia sees NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat. Any good realist would understand axiomatically that if you take a military alliance that was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union during the Cold War and you march it up to Russia's doorstep, the Russians are going to be scared. They're going to be really scared and they're going to react. That's a realist world view at play. But Europe was dominated by liberals, as was the United States. This is a different way of thinking about international politics. The balance of power is largely irrelevant now. We don't have to worry about that. What we want to do is spread institutions like the EU and NATO eastward. We want to spread democracy eastward. We want to spread economic independence. We want to get the East Europeans hooked on capitalism and so forth and so on. And the end result is we'll all live happily ever after. Well, it didn't work out very well. And you now have a situation in Europe where I believe that, except for places like Hungary, where there are realists and a few other small enclaves in Europe, I think liberal thinking about international politics and liberal thinking about Ukraine still dominates. And the end result is we have gotten ourselves, and we are now in deep trouble because we didn't think like good realists.
Thank you.
I had the privilege to write a book also about it, this Fukuyama moment and this neoliberal way of thinking. And I had the privilege that I got a blurb from the professor, and I'm very proud of it. But what concerns me again is that if we use Fukuyama and this Fukuyama moment to describe the mindset of the liberal elites in the 90s, I think if we follow the mindset and the paradigm shift of Fukuyama and those people since then, it's also concerning, because what happened in the 90s, they were saying that, you know, our way of life, our way of political system, our way of economic model, our way of globalization, our way of governance this is how we won the Cold War, and this is what would benefit everyone, and the entire world should adapt to that. And this was described as the end of history. But then, after 20 years, when they realized that some countries didn't adapt to this model, they have a different political system, they have a different economic structure, different way of globalization, but they still are successful. So they are coming up. And then they realized that the end of history model is not working, and they started something new. But what happened after the Ukrainian war? These type of people, the liberals, came back with the same old idea, but in a little bit of a reframed version of it. So now, if you read them, what they say is, end of history didn't come yet, but it will come. We just have to wait until it arrives. And before that, there will be an ultimate battle between the so-called democracies, who are obviously the good guys, the good model of governing, globalization, politics, and so on, and the so-called bad guys, the autocracies. And we have to prepare for that ultimate inevitable conflict between them. It's a kind of a description of a third world war, a potential future third world war, and after it, the end of history will come. So my as a Hungarian realist, my concern is that I don't want to describe the world like this. Because if we start describing the world like this, then it's extremely dangerous, because it, not just ideologically, but from a thinking method point of view, it leads us into direct confrontation and the bloc formation logic, which is against the interest of, I think, my country, Hungary, and I think it's against the interest of at least 180 other countries on earth.
Just very quickly, just to pick up on what you said, I think one of the distinguishing characteristics of liberalism when it's applied to foreign policy is, as you say, to describe the world in terms of good guys and bad guys. And when the United States goes to war, the other side is always the Third Reich, the leader is always Adolf Hitler, and so forth and so on. And when you think in those terms, it's very difficult to reach an accommodation with the other side. Because how can you negotiate with Adolf Hitler, right? You're dealing with the font of all evil. And this is one of the problems that we face today. How can you negotiate with Vladimir Putin, right? It's just impossible. It's like asking us again to negotiate a deal with Hitler. And just to go to realism for 1 second, it's very important to understand that realism treats states as black boxes. It treats all states as principally the same in terms of whether or not they're good guys or bad guys. There are no good guys or bad guys in the realist story. States are just black boxes. And this is one of the principal reasons that realism is deeply hated in the liberal West. You all understand that the United States is a thoroughly liberal country, right? And the West has become thoroughly liberal in its outlook. So when you have a view of foreign policy like realism that doesn't divide the world up into good guys and bad guys, people in the West are not going to like that. And they're going to think that somebody like me, who is a hardcore realist, is a deeply immoral person because I don't recognize good and evil.
What we say here in Hungary, at least as a counter-argumentation, is that we also moral persons. But our morality is different, because we think that our first and foremost loyalty goes to our community and our nation. And our job is to protect and save and bring a prosperous future for our country. And through this lens, we see the world. And we don't want, so in a very political term, I don't want to save the world, I want to save Hungary. And I think it's a moral position as well, different than the liberal one, but it's also a moral position. So I think all realists should not accept the argumentation of the liberals that they are the moral ones and the realists are the non-moral people, because that's not true. That's a different type of morality, which is based on, as a footnote, I would say, based on the Bible as well. So it has a religious basis as well.
Okay. Anything to add? No. Okay.
Yeah, I just say this is going to be very quick. If you think about a word that the liberals use all the time, it's international community. They talk about the international community. And just think about that first word, international, international. It's fundamentally at odds with the notion that you have a nation state, a national community, that you should privilege over the international community. You see very clearly in the use of those two words, international and national, the difference between a liberal perspective and a realist perspective. Sorry.
No. So can I translate? So the reason why Europe is doing this policy is because they are locked in the liberal thinking. And so for me, it's always hard as an analyst, it's hard to bring home the fact that people just think in a bad way about their interests. So But again, it sounds very plausible. But we are short on time, and I think we should jump. We have like 10 minutes left. One of my concerns about realism and what's happening in the world, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in Hungary, is how can one pursue a realist foreign policy? Is realism something that you actually pursue, or realism is like a straitjacket? You can't do anything else but to act at the end of the day as a realist. And if not, and if realism is a choice, then how do you make this choice? What is your take on this, Professor? What would you advise to Hungary if you were, nominated as an advisor?
Let me make two sets of comments. Talk about realism in general, and then just say a few words about Hungary. You want to understand that during the unipolar moment, which runs from roughly 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses, to about 2017, during the unipolar moment, there was only one great power by definition on the planet, and it was the United States of America. So you had no great power competition. You can't have great power competition when there's only one great power. And that was a period when the United States could act as a liberal state and not a realist state in the world arena. Because again, there were no great power politics. And we did very much act like a liberal great power. That world went away in 2017. We now live in a multipolar world. And what we have not talked about is the rise of China. It's very important to understand that China is a peer competitor to the United States. And once you're back in a world where there is great power competition, right, a country like the United States, when it's dealing with those other great powers, has no choice but to act like a good realist country. Now, what the United States is now doing vis-a-vis China is acting like a great power traditionally does. It's acting in a very realist way. All you have to do is talk to the Chinese, and they will tell you clearly that they understand the United States has its gun sights on China. The United States is acting like a realist state, but it masks its realist behavior with liberal rhetoric. It's always done that, the United States, that is. But in this case, you see it at play again. Now, the question is, how do I think this applies to Hungary? I think Hungary has basically behaved as a realist state in Europe since the end of the Cold War. And I think that is an anomalous case. I think most European countries have not behaved in a realist fashion, much like the United States, they've behaved in a liberal fashion. I think moving forward, Hungary has no choice but to act in a realist fashion. And it's going to have to think not only about how to deal with Russia, it's going to have to think about how to deal with China, because China is going to wield great influence in Europe. China is going to wield great influence all around the planet. There's going to be a significant competition between the United States on one side and China on the other side. And as I said, that's going to be a realist competition. And Hungary is going to be in between, as are virtually all the European states. And Hungary is going to have to think smartly about how to deal with both China and the United States from an economic point of view and a security point of view. And if Hungary is smart, they will continue to act in a realist fashion.
Balázs is one of the architects of Hungarian foreign policy and this very realist brand of it. What would you highlight in our policies?
Well, I think that despite all the turbulences, 2025 is still a very important year for us, because this Hungarian connectivity-based strategy for the new great power rivalry or competition world order that's the first year when it's actually in place. And this is why for us it was very important that we have Donald Trump in the White House, with whom we also can start working on a strategic agreement between Hungary and United States, because what we can achieve now is unfortunately, if you look on Brussels or if you look on Europe, this is what I'm always telling everyone, that guys, you have to realize that you are the most isolated power center right now on Earth, because you cut ties with the Russians, which brought energy problems for you. You started an economic warfare with China 2 years ago, which is your biggest export market, and you have an ideological confrontation with the United States, new leadership, and the geopolitical confrontation. They want peace in Ukraine, and you want war in Ukraine. So the Europeans are extremely isolated. And compared to that, I think our position is relatively very good. We are members of European Union, so all the negative decisions of them are affecting us, but we still can have an independent position, and we can benefit from that, as it was described by the professor. So now what we're working on is to establish a reasonable, pragmatic cooperation with the Russians during war period and also for after war period. We have a very good strategic cooperation with the Chinese when the entire European continent was turning against them. We were also we remained pragmatic and reasonable and rational. So the economic cooperation is getting stronger, and we were very much in favor on the Donald Trump and the American Republican circles, and we share their vision that Europe shouldn't be liberal. Europe should be a community of independent member states who are working together. So their focus is on the member states, and in this description, Hungary can play a very important role, and I think we have a pretty good chance to make a deal with the new administration of the United States. And then we can say that there is a great power rivalry, and Hungary is a small country which was a loser of the 20th century, but we are able to establish proper positions to all directions with all the major powers. And that would mean, not just in 1 month's time or 1 year time, but in 10, 20, 30 years time, it would lead us into a position where we can say that relatively we also among the winners of the 21st century. This is our position. This is what we call and describe connectivity or economic neutrality. There are different, or Hungary first foreign policy. There are different expressions what we are using, but it reflects back on a very similar way of thinking.
Professor, in one of your recent books, in the Liberal Delusion one, you said that liberal foreign policy is something that only very rich states can, allow themselves to have, and only for a shorter period of time. And you were referring to the United States. Do you see like more realist turn in Europe, or this is something in your thinking that is inevitably coming?
I think that the principal reason that Europe has been able to pursue, or let me put it differently, European states have been able to pursue a liberal foreign policy, which I think is most clearly reflected in the European Union, was because of the presence of the American military in Europe. In other words, it was NATO that provided the underpinning of the European Union. And one of the reasons almost all European leaders I have met since the Cold War ended in 1989 have been deeply committed to keeping the Americans in Europe is because they understand that the United States is the pacifier. This is the American pacifier. To put it in slightly different terms, NATO is the pacifier. NATO underpins the European Union. The reason that the European Union is so tightly knit and it is tightly knit. It's a remarkable institution, right? The reason it is able to reach that point of unity, the reason that we can talk about Europe, just think about the use of that word Europe. We talk about Europe as if it were a single state. Of course, it's not, as you remind us. But we talk about Europe as if it's a single state, is because of the European Union. But again, you never want to forget that underpinning the EU, underpinning Europe, is the American pacifier, NATO. Now you have to ask yourself, where is the Trump administration headed with regard to the American commitment to Europe? As you know, Trump has contempt for the Europeans. Trump does not like Europeans, the Hungarians notwithstanding. And Trump would like to greatly reduce the American military footprint in Europe, right? And I believe if Trump was free to act, he would put an end to the American commitment to NATO, right? And you also want to remember that the rise of China and the fact that China is a peer competitor creates the famous pivot to Asia. And you all know that if you pivot to some place, you pivot away from another place. So pivoting to Asia means, in good part, pivoting from Europe. That has not happened yet because of the Ukraine war. But if that were to happen, if Trump gets his way and we greatly reduce the American commitment to Europe, the American footprint in Europe, and here we're talking about the military footprint, that will have significant consequences for the European Union and for that concept of Europe. And I think what's going to happen here over time is the Americans are going to reduce their presence in Europe. And I think you're going to see centrifugal forces that are already at play inside of Europe accelerate. And I believe over time, more countries in Europe will look like Hungary. More countries in Europe will think in terms of the national interest, and they'll think less in terms of being part of an international community, less in terms of being part of Europe, and more nationalistic. So my bottom line is, you do not want to underestimate the importance of the American military presence in Europe.
Well, if I may add to one argumentation, because I checked it a couple weeks ago, and never EU accession towards East, first Central Europe, then the Romanian turn, and so on and so on. It was always first the NATO. So first NATO membership, and then a couple of years after EU. So it's exactly the point you were making, that first securing the territory militarily, and then the economic integration. So this is how it goes. So it proves your point. My problem is that since the Brits left the European Union, and since we have serious political power decay, let's put it that way, in Germany and in France, who are the two major forces of managing the European integration. Now, the so-called unelected, and it's not a political term on my side, it's a rational description on them. So unelected bureaucrats and leaders, they are dictating and they are trying to dictate the policies. And their idea is that the only way to make Europe successful again is that they have to do something with the war. So they have to increase military production, which would increase GDP. And for this reason, they have to spend more. And they have to further having joint loan project. And to manage this, the joint loan project and the joint military production towards Ukraine, the only way to do it is further centralization of the power and get rid of those nation states who are arguing in favor of a different strategy. So what is really the case, whether European nations, Hungary, and some other countries as well, where there are real political turbulences in France, in the Netherlands, in many countries. Czech Republic is facing elections where these kind of realist political forces are taking the polls. So whether there will be enough countries, nation states, who are saying that this shouldn't be the job of the European bureaucrats, but it should be decided by the member states' leaders. And if there is no strategic agreement between them, because some countries want to go to one direction and other countries want to go to another direction, but we still want to keep ourselves together because the single market makes sense, then we have to make a compromise. But first of all, the national side, if I may put it that way, the side of the nation of Europe, they have to show strength in politics to push back of this liberal joint loan projects, centralization, and fueling the war strategies. So we have to have an alternative, and we have to push back in every country. This is why the upcoming elections, both in Hungary and both abroad, are critical ones.
Can I just make a quick point? And I think you made this point earlier, Balázs, but if the Americans reduce their presence in Europe and you begin to see these centrifugal forces I described come into play, the question is, how do you deal with that problem? And I think the way you deal with that problem, or one way you deal with that problem, and I think that you might have said this earlier on, although my memory is not 100% clear, is if you're in Brussels, you threat inflate. You describe the Russians as the greatest possible danger to Europe. Because if you have an other out there, if you have this threat out there that threatens all of Europe, then there are very powerful incentives for the European states to work together to deal with that threat. And I've long believed that European bureaucrats, and I even think some European leaders, are overstating the Russian threat for purposes of getting the Europeans not to only spend money on their own defense establishment, but to keep Europe together. And of course, if I'm right, and if that's what's going to happen here, and the European establishments are going to threat inflate, that's just going to make the relations between Russia and Europe more poisonous, not less poisonous with the passage of time.
Okay, we are very short on time, but maybe one last question from my part, because maybe we'll not be very much castigated if we run a little lengthier. So the word of liberalism is getting to an end, or it is a more realist word that is coming. Do you see, for a country like Hungary, is it more like an opportunity or more like a threat? Should we embrace opportunities, or should we be more, cautious? And please try to be succinct. Sorry, sirs. So, what is your take on that?
Well, I think that if other countries become more realist in their outlook, it makes it easier for Hungary to work with those countries, which I think is all for the good. I think one of the problems that Hungary has had over probably the last 20 years is that Hungary has been out of step with the rest of Europe. Hungary has thought about the world more in realist or nationalist terms than its fellow European countries, and that creates all sorts of problems. But I think that world is going away, and I think as time goes by, more and more European states will think in realist terms. Is that necessarily a good thing? I'm not sure. I mean, the problem here is that during the unipolar moment, Europe was a remarkably peaceful place. And in a way, it's depressing to think that that's going to go away. If you think about the Ukraine war, it's absolutely horrible what's happened in Ukraine. And it would be nice if we could go back to unipolarity. We could go back to a period when there was peace in Europe, or there was peace in Europe for the most part. But what I'm saying here is that if you think about the situation in Europe today and you think about the situation moving forward, realism is going to become more relevant because Europe is going to be a less peaceful place. And although I think it's important to think in realist terms, it does not warm the cockles of my heart to think that Europe is going to be less peaceful in the future than it was during the unipolar moment.
Say something optimistic, Balázs, please.
I'm optimistic. I think it's a great opportunity for Hungary, and it's already paying off, and it will pay off in the future as well if we are able to remain stable and united on this policy. And sorry, Professor, I have to say I have to defend realism from you as well, because I think the realist way of understanding of the word, or if we are not talking about foreign policy, but more from an ideological point of view, I would describe it the national conservative way of thinking, is the only way, I think, in this new world order, how you can prevent war. Because based on the liberal ideology or indoctrination, it's impossible to imagine that you can prevent war. Because you are the good guy based on your own principles, you are morally superior, you have your interests, and you want to force them on the others, whether they like it or not. So I think this realist point of view, when you make a calculation on the costs and the consequences of the war, the potential negative change on the power structure, and where your basic logic is that we are not superior than others, and we are just the same, and we should be in a way tolerant towards each other. That's the only concept, I think, what could work in the 21st century, and using that concept in international politics, we have the possibility to prevent war. And I would warn everybody that when we had the unipolar moment, we also had some wars based on the unipolar peace period. We Hungarians shouldn't be warned on the Balkans war, Iraq war, and there are many other examples. So it's not the case, not even in Europe, that during the unipolar moment we didn't have, okay, we Hungarians were not suffering and not engaging, luckily, in a war. But I think if we remain on the track of liberal internationalism, as it is argued by Fukuyama and those kind of people, then we will end up sooner or later in a direct war confrontation, as it happened with other European countries who signed up to the proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. So I think if we take seriously that during that transition period of the world order, we want to de-escalate and we want to prevent confrontation, realism and national conservative thinking and description of the world order is the only way out.
No strike back. Or anything to add at this point?
No, I agree. What has been said about realism, for sure. There's no question that liberalism, as I wrote in The Great Delusion during the unipolar moment, led to lots of trouble. It led to the disaster in Russia, for sure. So I don't deny that. My only point was that the fact that Europe was relatively peaceful, and I agree it wasn't 100% peaceful, but that it was relatively peaceful during the unipolar moment was a good thing. And I do agree that pursuing a liberal foreign policy ultimately undermined that situation, for sure.
We have agreement.
Okay, it's a great agreement at the end. I've been enjoying facilitating this conversation very much. Realists may be dinosaurs, but believe me, dinosaurs are cool, and it's great to talk to them. And thank you very much for joining us to this morning conversation. And I encourage you to take part in the other discussions during the whole day, and also to grab Professor Mearsheimer or Political Director Orban for conversations in the corridors. Thank you very much for your attention, and have a great day.